Thank you for everyone who's joined us. We're going to give it a minute and then we will get started. Right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know there's going to be some more people joining us both online and on Facebook. So I just want to welcome everyone today to the Hot Topics, and this one is on moving water. And I just lost my notes, so I'm going to um, move us to the pledge, and then right after the pledge, I will tell you a little bit about today's topic. So we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if everybody could join me, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Bear with me for just a moment. And here's just a couple of notes for you. All of our lines are muted, so just know that if you have any questions or anything like that, right now you can put them in chat. This presentation today is streaming on Facebook and the webinar is being recorded. Just know that your chat is not a personal chat in recorded conversations. So even if you're individually chatting to someone within the group, you're going to find that that chat is potentially available later on. And this video will also be available on the Hot Topics playlist for YouTube. So thank you to all of our elected officials for being here today. Since I don't have a list available, it would be great if you would put your information into the chat so that we can see who's here today. And we thank you for taking the time to be with us. So Floridians may not agree on many issues, but preservation of the environmental gem that is the Everglades unites us all, or at least it should. I grew up in South Florida, and the Everglades was somewhere that we visited on a very regular basis. My parents really loved nature, and so we spent a lot of weekends out at the Everglades, I think counting all the alligators. But today we're fortunate to have the author of a book that tackles some of the most important issues surrounding this unique treasure. In her new book, Moving Water, The Everglades and Big Sugar, author Amy Green tackles many questions, including, is it possible to save a complex ecosystem such as the Everglades, or once degraded, are such ecological wonders gone forever? What kind of commitments, economic, scientific, and social, will it take to rescue our vulnerable natural resources? What influences do special interests wield in our everyday lives? And what does it take to push real reform through our democracy? Hot Topics has welcomed a number of authors through the years, and today's program adds a new chapter to the tradition. Joining us to discuss the book is Gabrielle Milch. Gabrielle is familiar to many League members as the co-chair of League of Women Voters Orange and Seminole Natural Resources Committee from 2017 to 2020. She currently serves as the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the nonprofit advocacy organization St. John's Riverkeeper in the Middle Basin, Orange, Seminole, Volusia Lake, and parts of Marion County since 2019. She has a long history of working with citizens and communities on environmental issues with an emphasis on clean water issues. Her life's work with water conservation advocacy and awareness keep her busy. She's a believer in Florida-friendly landscaping practices to reduce water and land pollution. She loves the outdoors and Florida's water and is an avid paddler. So welcome, Gabrielle and Amy. We are looking forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm just truly grateful that you all have invited me here today to speak with Amy on this very important topic, moving water, the Everglades and Big Sugar. And I too am an Everglades lover, been down there. And I know, Amy, this book you finished in 2019 and have done a lot of research on it. Could you tell us a little bit about why you picked this project and what motivated you to write a book about such political science? It's a political science book.
Well, sure. So I got kind of sucked into this back in 2008. I was covering big news at the time in Everglades Restoration. The governor at the time, Charlie Crist, had announced just a monumental deal where the state would buy out U.S. Sugar Corp. And U.S. Sugar is the nation's oldest and largest sugar producer. And the state planned to buy out U.S. Sugar and put this land toward Everglades restoration. U.S. Sugar is part of a very large farming community south of Lake Okeechobee called the Everglades Agricultural Area, and it's situated really in the heart of what used to be the Everglades. And so at the time, this was seen as a very historic development in Everglades restoration because it was seen as a very significant way in restoring the historic flow of the Everglades. And so at the time, it was before I was a radio journalist at WMFE, and I started working on an article for Newsweek magazine about the Everglades Foundation, which was very involved in the negotiations of this deal. Just a powerhouse of an organization on the Everglades. And so during the course of my reporting, I called Mary Barley, whose husband established the Everglades Foundation, and asked for some background information on the organization. And she basically told me her own biographical story, which was the story of how the Everglades Foundation got started. And so I could immediately see that Mary Barley had lived an extraordinary life. And so a few weeks later, I drove down to Isla Morada in the Florida Keys, which is where Mary Barley lives. And I did a second article for the Christian Science Monitor. It was a personality profile on her, and just kind of got smitten with this whole Everglades story. And so a few years later, I called Mary back and asked whether she would be interested in me writing a book about her life, and she said yes.
Well, that's quite a wonderful story, and I know that she lost her husband right before that, and that really put her heart and soul into it, and it was a very healing and important topic for her to work on over the time, and it didn't give her much time to feel sorry for herself in some respects for her loss, and she fought for something that was really pretty extraordinary. So you're very fortunate. I care about water and it being swimmable and fishable and clean drinking water for people, like in the St. Johns River. And the headwaters of the Everglades are here in Central Florida. Have you ever traveled on Shingle Creek and seen some of the headwater areas?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. My daughter is 7 now, and when she was a little younger, I took her down to Shingle Creek and took her kayaking down Shingle Creek. Yeah.
Awesome. So I truly enjoyed the expose about the disaster and political intrigue and some of the health concerns for people with the Everglades and the toxic algae blooms. How did you handle thinking about the toxins and all down there for all the people? How can they deal with that?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, maybe what I should do is go back a little bit for people who are not very familiar with the book and give a little more information on what it's about. Um, Moving Water is the first book to tell the story of George and Mary Barley. And in the early 90s, George Barley was just a dynamo of an Everglades advocate with a level of influence in Everglades politics and policy that really was on the same level of the Secretary of the Interior at the time. He was a wealthy real estate developer in Orlando. Mary Barley assisted him with his business dealings. And in 95, George Barley died very tragically in a plane crash. He was on his way to Jacksonville to meet with the Army Corps of Engineers about the Everglades, and his plane crashed and he died. And so within weeks, really, Mary Barley took up her husband's cause and in 96 led a campaign for a ballot initiative that was aimed at taxing sugar growers to raise money for Everglades restoration. And at the time, this was the most expensive political campaign in Florida history. And today, Mary Barley remains very engaged and very involved in Everglades restoration through the Everglades Foundation, which is a very powerful organization, and the Everglades Trust, which you may remember back to 2018, gave Governor Ron DeSantis a very critical endorsement during his campaign for governor, which you'll remember the environment and water issues were very central to his campaign. So I guess with that background in mind, the book takes a pretty in-depth look at how the Barleys did it, how they ran their campaign. They went up against a very, very powerful special interest group in Tallahassee and Washington. Big Sugar is how it's often referred to in political circles. And so, for anyone who is interested in the Everglades and making a difference in the Everglades, in some ways, Moving Water might be a playbook. But I'm asked a lot what people can do, as Florida continues to experience these very, terrible environmental problems with our waterways, like toxic algae, you mentioned, nutrient pollution, a lack of water in some places, too much water in other places. And so to, kind of taking inspiration from George Barley and Mary Barley, I would recommend, paying attention, keeping up with the issues, read your newspaper, listen to your public radio station, WMFE 90.7 News, and pay attention to who your elected leaders are and what they're doing. Everglades Restoration, it's all, funded by state and federal dollars. And this is all, based, it's our elected leaders who make the decisions on how much money is the Everglades are going to get and where it's going to go. And so make sure your elected leaders know what's important to you in the legislature and in Congress. And you can also support organizations like the Everglades Foundation, the Everglades Trust. Audubon is another organization that does a lot on the Everglades. So does that answer your question?
Sure, yes.
I didn't want to ramble too much.
No, that was awesome. So so the problems down there and climate change could have effects on the future and the restoration, and encouraging our elected officials is very important. And in the book, you go over that. So with the elected officials, do you have any recommendations what we as citizens can do to help?
Yeah. So again, keep up with the elected leaders and make sure they know what issues are important to you. But at the heart of a lot of the problems that we're seeing in our waterways today is something called nutrient pollution. And nutrient pollution, sometimes it's called um, anyway, nutrient pollution is something that begins in many of our own front lawns. It comes from fertilizers that we use to help our lawns grow. Sometimes fertilizers that farmers and it's used in agriculture to help crops grow. And other pollutants, that flow, from our roadways into the canals that ultimately lead to our major waterways. All of the pollutants and the nutrient pollution that flows into these canals, it functions in our waterways in the same ways it functions in our lawns, which is that it helps things grow. And sometimes it helps the wrong things grow, like algae. And when one algae is able to kind of take control of an ecosystem and outcompete all of the other living things in that ecosystem, it can cause a lot of problems, and scientists often call this a harmful algae bloom. And some of these harmful algae blooms can be toxic and very dangerous. And so that's been a big problem that's been one of the big problems we've had in Florida in recent years. So, if you're interested in just kind of starting in your own lawn and pay attention to the kind of fertilizers that you're using on your lawn, conserve water. Try not to water your lawn more than it really needs it. You can conserve water around your house. And just kind of pay attention and take those very simple personal responsibilities.
Absolutely. So we care about the swimmable and fishable, and I know that a lot of us have children and grandchildren and all, and about moms for clean water. How do you deal with that with your daughter?
Okay. Yeah, so Gabby and I spoke briefly this morning on the phone, and like I told Gabby this morning, I love the Everglades. Like, I just am fascinated by it. I love reading about it and learning about it. I love going there and getting my feet wet, and I just have a passion and a heart for it. And so, if I am able to, when I have the opportunity to share that with other people, and if I can get other people just a little excited about the Everglades, it just makes me very happy. So with my daughter, like I mentioned, she's 7. The joke in our house is kind of, I'm this published environmental author. She does not like going outdoors. And when we do nature trails and things like that, she is pretty ready to wrap it up pretty soon. But I did take her to the Everglades over the holidays. She's been home with me a lot during the past year during the pandemic. And so she's heard me wrapping up this book project. And I also produced a podcast on the Everglades for WMFE called Drained. And so she heard me working on that toward the end of last year. And so she said, "Mommy, I want to see the Everglades." And I said, "Okay." And so my mom and I took her to the Everglades over the holidays. And I think she really liked it, and she was interested in getting her feet wet, which made me so proud. And the thing about the Everglades, I heard Mary Barley make this point in another event last week, is that anything you really want to do or you really like doing, you can do it in the Everglades. There's boating, there's fishing, kayaking, hunting, hiking. um, it's just a fun place to get outside and be outdoors. And the fascinating thing about the Everglades is that it's the subject of this restoration effort that is one of the largest and most complex in the world. And so not only are you getting outside, but you're getting outside in a very fascinating place.
Well, I see over here in the chat box, we have a couple of questions that I'm going to read to you. And this is kind of a little off track, but very important for Florida. One of the questions is, what impacts do septic tanks have on the waters of the Everglades? And is there funding being provided for homeowners to switch and then to switch to public sewers? Do you know much about that?
Yeah, so that's been a very big topic in the legislature. And former Governor Rick Scott, that was a big issue for him, and he put some money toward that issue, which is great. And what happens there is when septic tanks, when they get a little leaky, again, we're talking about nutrient pollution. That nutrient pollution can get into our groundwater, which we use as our drinking water in most parts of Florida. And it can also flow into the canals that lead to the waterways that lead to our important waterways in Florida. And that nutrient pollution can feed the toxic algae blooms, the harmful algae blooms that have been such a problem in Florida in recent years. And so that's why there is a lot of talk about putting money toward improving those septic tanks, getting those homeowners onto sewer systems rather than using septic tanks, especially in very sensitive spring sheds like the Wekiva River spring shed in Central Florida. And there is money for that. The problem with that is two things. It would cost a lot of money to replace all of those septic systems. And I don't quite have those numbers right at my fingertips. It is good to put money toward replacing as many as we can, especially in the most sensitive areas, like in the Wekiva, but it would be very difficult to replace them all. And it's also important to remember that there are a lot of causes for nutrient pollution in our waterways, and that is one of them. We talked about fertilizers already. So while it's good that the politicians are, putting money toward that problem, it's one of kind of a suite of problems, and it's not, that's not going to be the silver bullet that oftentimes we're looking for.
No, we have other issues in the Everglades as well as in Central Florida with biosolids being spread on the headwaters of like the St. Johns River and even Lake Jessup area. And we have problems with wastewater treatment plants too. And getting those hooked up is really difficult. And of course, the fertilizers. Another person was wanting to know about the federal government and how are they participating in the restoration at this point?
Okay, so when Everglades Restoration was signed into law in December 2000, so 20 years ago, the agreement at the time was that the state and federal government would split the cost of the restoration evenly. And at the time, this was a pretty historic thing. Usually the federal government would pay more and the state would contribute, some of that. But they decided to split it 50-50. So, and at the time, the funding was going to be allocated, it would be allocated through the Water Resources and Development Act, which is a bill that Congress approves usually every 2 years, I think. However, when they signed Everglades Restoration into law in 2000, there was not another water bill after that for another 7 years. And so right off the bat, the restoration was behind, basically, because Congress just didn't act on another water bill for another 7 years. The federal government also has been kind of slow, or hasn't been paying the full 50% of the restoration. And so so what you've seen is the state, taking more of a lead on this. And you saw Jeb Bush back in the early 2000s kind of step up, in the absence of the federal government, and approve a measure called Accelerate, which was aimed at getting Everglades restoration going and speeding it up. But that is one reason why Everglades restoration has been delayed, is because the federal government has been a little slow to act on it. In recent years, we've seen more funding from the federal government, especially as these toxic algae problems have been kind of urgent, and have given leaders kind of more of a political reason to, act on the issue more. And we've seen Congress, approve more projects like a reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee, which was a big issue back in 2018, if you can remember. So
the reservoirs in Florida are a little bit difficult because of evapotranspiration and loss of water, but the big flow, what you talked about in your book about moving water, that's a big story. And I don't think people really understand how the water sheds off the land. And we say the headwaters are in Shingle Creek, but how does that water actually get to the Everglades? And once it's there, it has to go through the lake, or before. Can you go over that a little bit for people who might not understand it?
Yeah, so the Everglades, as some people may not be aware, it begins in Central Florida with the headwaters of the Kissimmee River, and specifically that's Shingle Creek, which is in Osceola County. And historically, the Kissimmee River flowed very slowly, a slow meandering river, which is what I'm trying to say, into Lake Okeechobee. And Lake Okeechobee was very shallow, and the water just kind of spilled over its southern brim. I think Marjory Stoneman Douglas, in her classic book, which coined the phrase river of grass, I think she describes it like a spoon that you just, kind of have at the surface of your, soup or whatever. And the water just kind of spilled over the southern brim, and it flowed very slowly as a large sheet into Florida Bay. And that was the Everglades. And so today, to make way for development and agriculture in the state of Florida, that has been altered very drastically. And instead of flowing south, a large part of the water flows east and west from Lake Okeechobee through the St. Lucie River and the Caloosahatchee River. And a large dam has been constructed around Lake Okeechobee, kind of ending that southern flow forever. There are water conservation areas in South Florida, stormwater treatment areas that are aimed at improving water quality. And so it's not really a natural system anymore, although there are a lot of parts of the Everglades that are very beautiful, and it's very nice to get outdoors and enjoy.
There's a question here about the water management districts, and when our current governor, he did some work down there in the beginning. Could you tell us a little bit about the South Florida Water Management District and kind of what happened when he was elected?
Which governor are you talking about?
Ron DeSantis.
Governor DeSantis. Oh, of course. Okay, so sure. The South Florida Water Management District is the state agency that oversees Everglades restoration. And especially under former Governor Rick Scott, the Water Management District and Rick Scott were seen as being very closely aligned with sugar growers who have been seen throughout history as being obstructive in Everglades restoration. Now, sugar growers they are participating in Everglades restoration in a number of ways. They are paying taxes toward restoration. And they also are doing what's called best management practices, which are aimed at improving water quality in the Everglades. Things like adjusting irrigation techniques and paying attention to the amount of fertilizers they're using in their crops. But sugar growers have had this kind of central almost kind of like a villainous role in the story of Everglades restoration because of their location directly south of Lake Okeechobee in the heart of the historic Everglades, and because in the past 20, 30, 40 years, there has been a lot of litigation over the Everglades, and sugar growers have fought this litigation and fought some of these political efforts to clean up the Everglades because they want to continue farming where they are. And so what makes Governor Ron DeSantis unique, and what makes this a very hopeful time for Everglades advocates, is Governor Ron DeSantis, if you can remember back to 2018, ran a very anti-sugar campaign for governor. Toxic algae was a central issue of his campaign, and he ran against the sugar growers. And he was really the first politician in modern Florida political history to stand up to sugar growers, a very, very powerful interest group in Tallahassee and Washington. He was really the first politician to stand up to them and to live and tell the tale. He was really the first one to stand up to them and win. And so for Everglades advocates, this was very hopeful for them. And so after Governor Ron DeSantis was elected, he replaced all of the board members on the South Florida Water Management District who were seen as being very closely aligned with sugar growers, and replaced them with people who are seen as environmental, people like Jackie Thurlow-Lippisch or Alligator Ron Bergeron, and of course, Governor Ron DeSantis has put millions of dollars toward Everglades restoration since he has been governor.
So agriculture and big sugar and best management practices. I used to work for the University of Florida, and I know that a lot of those best management practices are voluntary for some of the agriculture down there. And we had a little conversation before about the best management practices. Could you explain how we can encourage our elected officials to get them to be less than voluntary, or have them be mandatory, these best management practices?
Yeah, so a lot of the environmental groups would, would take a look at these best management practices and say they're just not enough. These best management practices were designed by the sugar growers, back in the early 90s when Everglades Restoration was first being crafted. And sugar growers also are paying taxes toward restoration. But again, the environmental groups would say it's not enough. The state has invested millions, perhaps billions of dollars in restoration. Just as an example, there's been a lot of litigation over water quality in the Everglades. And so the state has invested, maybe billions of dollars in stormwater treatment areas, which are human-made wetlands, aimed at cleansing the water as it flows. The vegetative tissues absorb the nutrients, and slowly the water flows clean as it flows through these stormwater treatment areas. In South Florida, the state has constructed stormwater treatment areas that are the biggest of their kind in the world. The world has never seen an effort like this, like what we have in the Everglades. And the state is paying that. And so you and I and every other Floridian is paying for that. And so a lot of what my book talks about is the Barleys just believed that wasn't right. They wanted sugar growers. They thought sugar growers should pay their fair share, as they put it. And so that was what fueled a lot of their campaign work.
The polluters pay type of a mentality is what we kind of need in Florida in so many ways. I mean, look at Lake Apopka, the headwaters of the St. Johns River. We have the Ocklawaha River. We've got, a lot of money goes to the Everglades, and it should, because it's an important water resource for drinking water in South Florida as well. It's not just all about nature, but it is about the drinking water. Do you have any advice for future legislation, or how the League of Women Voters can get involved at a different level with this?
Well, the first thing that pops into my mind is that ballot initiative that Mary Barley advocated for back in '96, which again was aimed at taxing sugar growers to raise money for Everglades restoration. And what ended up happening there is a little complicated, but one component of that was not approved by voters, but another component of that was, and the legislature never implemented it. And Mary Barley took that issue to court in the late 90s, and the Florida Supreme Court ultimately ruled that it was up to the legislature to implement that, and they never did. And so, so that would be, one thing that people could advocate for or speak out for.
Do you know of any pending legislation this year that will help assist in our water quality issues in the state of Florida?
There are a couple of stories that I was planning to look into on that later this week and next week. Right now, my mind is kind of in climate change.
Yeah. Sea level rise is a huge one, and have they done a lot with sea level rise in the plans? Do you know?
Yes. And so, again, Governor Ron DeSantis has been billing himself as kind of a green governor. And so he, in January, announced his state budget proposal for the spring legislative session. And part of that was what he called a Resilient Florida program that would make grants available to municipalities for sea level rise mitigation. He, in the past, has appointed a chief science officer and a chief resilience officer who the chief resilience officer left after being in that position for only a few months, and that position has not been filled since then. And that's all great. You know, it's a big change from the administration of former Governor Rick Scott, who was not a strong leader on these issues. The thing that a lot of the environmental groups are pointing out is that, you know, while it's great that Governor Ron DeSantis is, you know, giving these issues his attention, his administration has done little or nothing on the emissions that are responsible for climate change. And there is a bill in the legislature this session that is aimed at it's a clean energy bill that has set a goal of 2040 for 100% clean energy in the state of Florida. A lot of municipal governments have set similar goals. In Orlando, I think the goal is 100% clean energy by 2050. But in the legislature, I think it's the third year this bill has been introduced, and during the past two sessions, it has not garnered a hearing. We also, at the beginning of the session, the House Speaker held a news conference kind of highlighting a suite of bills revolving around climate change and sea level rise. So the legislative session is underway. We'll just have to see how those things develop.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. Barbara?
Yes, we have a number of questions. It's very active. One of the questions in the Q&A is, how much do our activities here in Central Florida affect the Everglades ecosystem? And related to that, another one about a bigger drain on water than sugar is cattle. And Central Florida has one of the largest cattle ranches in the world, the Deseret, I think it's pronounced, ranch. And is anything being done to address its drawing of water?
Right. So Central Floridians have a big impact on the Everglades. You know, when we go back and think about nutrient pollution, you know, all of our nutrient pollution that flows into Shingle Creek, you know, flows into the Kissimmee River and then eventually makes its way into Lake Okeechobee. And so, you know, we as Central Floridians have a responsibility there for some of the nutrient pollution that we're seeing in the Everglades. And then, of course, there is a lot of cattle ranching in Osceola County. And so, you know, there's a risk for nutrient pollution there. One solution that is being employed there is something called conservation easements. And this is a situation where, you know, when it might be too expensive, you know, for the state to buy up land and protect that land and keep that land pristine, what the state can do is basically, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think the basic idea is to buy the right to future development on the land. And so the rancher is allowed to continue ranching on the land, but is not able, you know, to sell that land for, you know, shopping centers and, you know, residential complexes, and like, you know, like we see all over the state of Florida. And that's been pretty successful. You know, I have driven down there and I have been on ranch lands that are really extremely pristine, and that's great. so what a lot of the environmental groups are working on toward that, toward that end is more funding, because, again, especially under the administration of former Governor Rick Scott, we saw a lot of land conservation funding cut. And we've seen that come back a little bit since DeSantis was elected, but not to the level of where it was back in the early 2000s when Florida's land conservation program was really a leader in the nation.
I have another question here. It says, our water district in Orange County is part of the St. John's Water Management District. There's been a lot published about the kinds of people being appointed to water management boards by the governor. What role do you advise the league play in advocating for board members having some environmental background? Today, many appointees are developers, and the boards, to this writer, seem more like they are the fox guarding the hen house.
Yeah, so we've talked about how Governor Ron DeSantis, reshaped the board of the South Florida Water Management District and replaced those members with people who had more environmental backgrounds, and that's great. In the St. Johns River Water Management District, which the northern end of Orlando falls within that district, we have seen some board members coming from backgrounds that were more development oriented. And there's been some stories exploring those conflicts of interest. And there was one story in particular, and it was long ago enough that I can't remember the particulars, but it was a developer who the insinuation was that he was basically using his position to make permits available for development, I think. And so that is an ongoing problem, and that is one that anyone who cares about these issues should keep an eye on.
I think you spoke a little bit about conservation easements too, and I know that in some of the water management districts, they allowed conservation easements to be released, and that's pretty scandalous. And we have that issues in Split Oak on some roadways for mitigation, proposed roadways and things like that.
Okay, we have another toxic algae question. It says, one of your chapters refers to 10 parts per billion as the maximum threshold, or 60 drops in an Olympic swimming pool. And this person wonders, is that the sole cause, is phosphorus runoff the sole cause of that problem? And then related, he also says that he saw a documentary on Fox News digital platform, and it spoke about the fact that there are a lot of invasive species that are being, things are being eaten by the invasive species that are also changing the problem. So it's kind of a different attack from a different area than just the water.
Yeah, so 10 parts per billion, to me, this is one of the most fascinating narratives about Everglades restoration. I mean, really the miracle of the Everglades is that the watershed evolved in this extraordinarily low nutrient environment, and the reason it flourished was because of this competition for sustenance. There was so little nutrients that everything in the ecosystem had to compete for that. And that was the reason for the Everglades extraordinary biodiversity. So when we started settling in Florida and developing in Florida, that when that balance was upset by nutrient pollution, and specifically we're talking about phosphorus, the species that was able to gain the advantage over all the others was cattails. And so by the late 80s and early 90s, cattails were taking over the Everglades to the point where the situation was kind of existential. You know, the Everglades was in danger of becoming a system that no longer was a river of grass, but a river of cattails. And so, the cattails just caused a lot of problems because birds weren't able to forage for food and things like that. And so, so there was a lawsuit filed by the federal government against the state aimed at cleaning up this phosphorus problem. And the main reason for this phosphorus problem in the Everglades was farming in the Everglades agricultural area. And so that's where that narrative comes from. And that's where that narrative comes from, really. And that's kind of how sugar growers kind of became this villain of the Everglades. It kind of all began with that lawsuit. So, so there has, through the years, this has been, this 10 parts, teeny tiny 10 parts per billion, we're talking about almost nothing here. And it has been the source of just huge contentious political debate and, how to clean it up. And so what they ended up doing was building these massive stormwater treatment areas, and they're working. The good news is the stormwater treatment areas are working. There's just not enough of them. And so that's what the environmental groups are working on now. So what was the other part of the question? I can't remember.
About the invasive species?
Oh, so right, the invasive species. So what the person might be referring to is pythons. And the pythons have been a huge problem in the Everglades. And when they can take over, they, eat all of the other wildlife, and you see wildlife populations plummet because the pythons just eat everything. And so a lot of people, are aware, there have been python hunts to try to limit the population there. But when we talk about Everglades restoration, at this point, there's been one project that's reached completion, and it's a project that's aimed at invasive species, and it's aimed at developing insects or using insects to keep invasive plants in check. And so in my podcast, I did an interview on this and learned about a tree called the Melaleuca, which is kind of an infamous invasive species in the Everglades. And so under this restoration project, they have employed an insect to target the Melaleuca tree. And the population of Melaleucas in the Everglades is, it's under control better.
We probably only have time for one more question. It says, can you say more about what you mean when you say getting your feet wet? I've never been to the Everglades, but the picture I have in my mind does not include getting in the water.
Right. So this is one of the things that gets me so excited about the Everglades. Throughout history and, even today, the Everglades are very misunderstood. Early Floridians wanted to drain the Everglades, reclaim them is the words that they use, because the Everglades were seen as this useful swamp, this very terrible place to go. And but actually, when you go there, it's very wonderful to get into the Everglades and wade through the water. You know, it's Florida, so it's very hot. And so to get in the water is very cool and refreshing. You know, if you're someplace like Everglades National Park or Big Cypress National Preserve, you know, these areas are very pristine. And so the water is very clear and cool and refreshing. And, you know, it's fun to get in there and, you know, feel the muck on your feet and, you know, and to, you know, get in there with the water up to your thighs or whatever. And it just feels great. And it's, you know, some people might have this idea of the Everglades muck as being this kind of, you know, yucky thing. And it's not at all. It's actually very great to get into.
Okay, so the big finish here. What is your opinion? Can the Everglades be restored?
Well, you know, and there's actually disagreement over, you know, what are we talking about when we talk about restoration? You know, some people think the Everglades should be restored to a pristine state and, you know, farming should, you know, be out of there altogether. And, you know, but that's problematic because we've also got Miami and Fort Lauderdale and, you know, historically, you know, Miami International Airport was underwater, you know, and so the goal of Everglades restoration is not to take the system back to a pristine state, but to restore key functions like water storage and flow and water quality. And so that's what they're working on. And so a lot of Everglades restoration involves reservoirs. It's a project, you know, to describe Everglades restoration as a massive project would be putting it lightly. You know, there's a project in there when Everglades restoration was signed into law, there was a project in there to build a massive subterranean reservoir, and water would be injected underground and stored and could be drawn up, you know, when needed. And so, of course, later studies determined that, you know, this was not feasible the way it was conceived. And so they're working on some other solutions with that. So the main thing they're trying to work on is restore key functions and to preserve our drinking water supply for future generations in a state that is growing by leaps and bounds. The big problem, one of the biggest problems they're working on is water storage. We know that the Everglades needs a vast amount of more water to be healthy and to secure our drinking water population. And so the big question is, where are we going to put all this water in a state given our population today and given that it's growing to the degree that it's growing? And so that's a big problem that they're working on. So and as far as, you know, when you ask, can the Everglades be saved, you know, can these key functions be restored? I would say the answer to that is it's going to take a while, but you can listen to my podcast called Drained, available wherever you get your podcast for some more information on that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. You were both so helpful and we learned so much. I'm going to now turn it back over to Gloria to close us out.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. I mean, this was fascinating. Gabby and Amy, we're so thrilled that you were here with us today. I'm Gloria Picard, and I'm the co-president along with Sandy Vidal. You know, Amy, we're fortunate and grateful that you joined us. Congratulations on your book. We need it. We all need to read it.
Yeah.
We need to understand it. Reporting on the environment has been your award-winning journalism work. And not only do we know you from our prior hot topics, but we regularly hear you on NPR and WMFE 90.7 locally, and read your work in People, Newsweek, the New York Times, and the Christian Science Monitor. Wow. I love the Everglades too. And it's so interesting to understand that the Everglades begins right here in Central Florida with Shingle Creek, and how important it is to our quality of life and just how threatened it is. Thank you, Gabby, for moderating and interviewing Amy today and bring her to us, and to our Hot Topics chairs, Barbara Lanning and Sue Gilman, along with our Natural Resources Committee for bringing us this event. Now, speaking of Hot Topics chairs, Sue Gilman would like to say a few words. So I'm going to turn it over to Sue for just a moment.
Hi, everyone. Wasn't that a fascinating conversation about Florida's unique treasure, the Everglades? I'm Sue Gilman, currently co-chair of Hot Topics along with Barbara Lanning. And as you know, Hot Topics is the best regular public affairs forum in town. 10 times a year, the league hosts experts, local officials, and candidates for upcoming elections in an interactive format, exploring the hottest issues of concern to Central Florida. Hot Topics is also the league's best venue for communicating the important work being done by the advocacy committees to our membership and to the community. Have you been looking for the right way to serve the league? Hot Topics may just be it. We are actively searching for new leadership for Hot Topics. We have the next several topics teed up, which will make transition smooth and the learning curve gentle. Producing Hot Topics is a great way to be in touch with the committees and their work, as well as leaders in the community. If you are interested in participating in the planning and production of Hot Topics, or you want to discuss how it comes together, please call or email Barbara Lanning or myself, Sue Gilman. Our contact information is found on the membership page of the website, lwvoc.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And that's how we found Sue and Barbara. So we believe that we're going to get 2 new chairs just this way. So please let us know if you're interested. About the one Hot Topics that's coming up next. Typically our Hot Topics are on the second Wednesday of the month. So on April the 14th, Wednesday, April 14th, we're going to be talking about the effect of the pandemic on Orange County schools. Everybody's talking and thinking about what's happening to our schools. Dr. Maria Vasquez of Orange County Public Schools will be joined by representatives of the Orange County Health Department and one of the teachers' unions. So expect them to touch on the status of live and remote classes, student and teacher and staff safety, as more and more students participate in learning, get back to in-person learning. What happens to missing students who may have fallen through the cracks, and potential funding losses and mental health issues our students are facing. Moderated by Orlando Sentinel's Leslie Postal, this promises to be informative and important, whether or not you have school-age children yourself or not. The long-term implications to our community, because our children are falling behind, are far-reaching and go way beyond schools. And like today, we've also asked the panelists to discuss what the league should be advocating for at the local and state level relative to our schools. There are other important things that are coming up that we want to be sure that you remember and know about. So February was Black History Month and March is Women's History Month. So we're still celebrating both. The Coy Massacre exhibit at the Orange County Regional History Museum has been extended. The title of that exhibit is A Coy Massacre Exhibit. Yesterday, this was home, and it focuses on the Coy Massacre of 1920. I'm glad it was extended because I plan to go tomorrow and be sure that I can see that, just as I'm hoping that all of you will. In addition, at the Orange County Regional History Museum, we're going to be celebrating Women's History Month, and that will be on Thursday, March 18th from 12 to 1. And this virtual luncheon, there is a fee, $25. It's part of their fundraising. We are co-sponsoring it. And it's going to feature Mabel Norris Reese, Fearless Voice for Truth, who is another journalist. Jackie Brockington and I will join a seasoned and interesting group of speakers. There's 2 competing events going on tomorrow evening that are both very, very important. First, our own league is sponsoring the Racial Wealth Gap at 7 o'clock. And it's a repeat of a very successful event that was sponsored by our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee in partnership with Bread for the World. It's more than a Zoom meeting. This is an experience with breakout groups and discussions that are profoundly impactful. We already have a very strong registration for that event. So Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. Also tomorrow evening down at Dr. Phillips' Front Yard Festival downtown will be a celebration of Women's History Month sponsored by the City of Orlando called Woman in Motion. It's going to feature Nichelle Nichols, who was a Star Trek actress in the remaking of NASA. This free event is first come, first seated event. So when you arrive, you'll be assigned to your own socially distant box for up to 5 people. And we're going to watch the inspiring true story of how Star Trek actress Nichelle Nichols pioneered the NASA recruiting program to hire people of color and the space agency's first female astronauts in the late 1970s and 80s. Finally, next month, Thursday, April 22nd at 6 o'clock will be our annual membership meeting. We'll do that again by Zoom, and please register for it on our website, lwvoc.org. And lastly, if you aren't a member, please join the League of Women Voters of Orange County. We need lots of warriors just like you. And this is also membership renewal time. So please be sure you have renewed your membership. And if possible, think about one of our higher level donation level memberships for us. That's one of the ways that we do raise funds. Thank you all again for being with us. These sessions are very popular and well attended, and we are thrilled to be able to offer them also by Facebook Live. Please have a great rest of your week. Enjoy your weekend, and everybody, good afternoon. Thank you.